Ever feel like there's something going on beneath the surface? Some kind of invisible current shaping everything from big global events down to, well, even just office politics.
Absolutely, that invisible force, that dynamic. That's really what we're calling power, and that's what we're diving into today.
Right. And to really get our heads around it, we've gathered some pretty interesting sources. We've got Manuel Castells looking back on his life's work on power. That gives us a big picture, a theoretical base.
Yeah, and then we're zooming right in with a historical comparison, China versus Europe, specifically looking at their power structures. Fascinating stuff from Gia, Roland, and Gia.
And we're also looking at how we even learn to think about power with a study on civic reasoning by Tavrona and Jagerskog, plus how language itself and our sort of ingrained habits play into it all. That's the Bourdieu and Foucault comparison.
And finally, something very current: gender dynamics in higher education. A report asking, even with more women enrolled, are the inequalities really gone?
Okay, so quite a range. Our mission here, really, is to pull out the key threads from all these different perspectives. What is power? How does it actually work in different places? And fundamentally, how does it shape our world?
Exactly. We want to give you a richer understanding, hopefully, without getting bogged down in overly academic language. A clearer lens, maybe.
Perfect. So let's start at the beginning. Defining power. Castells calls it a relational capacity. What does that actually mean in simple terms?
Well, it's less about someone just having power like an object and more about the relationship between actors. It's the ability within that relationship for one side to influence the decisions of the other, to get their own interests or values prioritized.
So it's always between people or groups, and it's not equal.
Precisely. It's inherently asymmetrical, he argues. In any power dynamic, someone has more of that capacity to influence the outcome.
Okay, so it's not just about, military force or physical threats.
Not solely, no. Castells points to two main ways it works. There is coercion, sure, like the state having the monopoly on violence, enforcing laws. But just as important, maybe even more so, is the construction of meaning.
Construction of meaning, like culture.
Exactly. How ideas, values, and norms are produced and spread. Think about media, education, even just the stories we tell each other. That shapes what we accept as normal or true or desirable. That's power operating by shaping our minds, essentially.
And Castell says this isn't just in politics or economics, right?
Right. He argues it's everywhere. Finance, production, culture, science, health, education. It permeates all dimensions of human life. It's woven into the fabric of everything.
Wow. He even called power relationships the DNA of societies, didn't he?
He did. Yeah. And the source code of all cultures, it really highlights just how fundamental he sees this dynamic. Understanding power is key to understanding why societies look and function the way they do.
Okay, so power is this fundamental relational force. Let's see how that plays out historically. This comparison between Imperial China and Premodern Europe sounds really interesting. What did Gia, Roland, and Xi find?
It's a really thought-provoking comparison, especially for that 9th to 14th century period. Basically, they suggest that in Europe, the ruler's absolute power was, relatively speaking, weaker than in Imperial China.
Weaker, really? I always picture those European kings as pretty absolute.
Well, weaker relative to their Chinese counterparts in this period, according to the study. But here's the interesting bit. They argue that in China, the relationship between the general population, the people, and the elites, like the scholar bureaucrats, was actually more balanced in terms of rights and power compared to Europe's people versus their hereditary lords.
Balance, how so?
A key example they give is the civil service exam system in China. It provided, at least in theory, a path for commoners to rise into the elite based on merit, on passing exams. Compare that to Europe, where elite status was largely based on birth, on hereditary titles.
So more social mobility, potentially, in China at that time.
That's the idea. And they propose something quite interesting. This more symmetric, more accessible elite structure in China might have actually helped stabilize autocratic rule, paradoxically, especially when the emperor himself held significant power.
How would that work? Why would that stabilize things?
Well, the thinking is, if the elite class feels somewhat accountable or connected to the broader population, and if there's a sense that merit plays a role, it can act as a buffer. It might reduce resentment and increase the system's overall resilience.
And did they find evidence for that stability?
They argue that, yes, during those specific centuries, autocratic rule appears to have been more stable overall in Imperial China compared to the more fragmented and often warring states of pre-modern Europe.
Fascinating. So historical context really shapes how power structures form and function.
Oh, okay, but how do we analyze power now in our own societies? The study on social science education, Torona and Jagerskog, what does it tell us about the tools we need? Right. It tackles how students, and by extension, how we can develop a more sophisticated understanding of power. They identified three really critical things needed for a qualified analysis.
Okay, what?
First, you need to actually identify the agent of power. Who or what group is actually doing the influencing? It sounds simple, but it's often missed.
Right. Not just saying the system, but who in the system.
Exactly. Second, understand that power isn't abstract. It's exercised through agency, through actions in specific arenas or situations. Where is this happening? In a boardroom, a classroom, online.
Okay, agent and arena. What's the third?
The third is grasping the relativity of power. Power isn't absolute. It exists in relation to other agents in that same arena. Who has more influence compared to whom in this specific context?
So it's always comparative, always contextual.
Precisely. And they argue this kind of analytical civic reasoning about power is more complex than just looking for simple cause and effect. It's about understanding potential, influence, push and pull.
And why is that important?
Because understanding power as this dynamic potential allows for more critical judgment. It helps you see beyond the surface and form more informed opinions on social issues, you know?
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's shift gears slightly and talk about language and those ingrained habits. The comparison of Bourdieu and Foucault seems key here. How do they help us understand power's connection to communication?
They both see discourse, the way we talk and think about things, as crucial, but they approach it slightly differently. Bourdieu, he really emphasizes language as a form of capital, like economic capital, but social and cultural.
Language is capital. How does that work?
Well, certain ways of speaking, certain vocabularies, even accents, can carry more prestige or authority in specific contexts. Think about a formal job interview. Someone whose natural way of speaking aligns with the interviewer's expectations might have an advantage, regardless of their actual skills.
So it reinforces existing hierarchies.
Yes, and he connects this to habitus, those deeply ingrained, almost unconscious dispositions, tastes, and ways of behaving that we pick up from our social background. Our habitus shapes how we communicate, and that communication, in turn, reproduces the social structures we grew up in.
Okay, so Bourdieu is focused on how our background shapes our communication, which then maintains the status quo. What about Foucault?
Foucault's famous concept is power knowledge. He argues that power isn't just repressive, it's productive. It actually produces knowledge, shapes what we consider to be true or rational.
Power produces knowledge.
Yeah. Think about how disciplines like medicine or psychology define what's normal or abnormal. Foucault would argue those definitions aren't neutral. They're intertwined with power dynamics that shape how we treat people, how we organize society. Power and knowledge constantly reinforce each other. It's embedded in our language, our institutions, our practices.
So for Foucault, the way we talk about things actually creates the reality that power then operates within.
That's a good way to put it. Power isn't just acting on us, it's working through us, through the knowledge and discourses we accept and use. Both thinkers, though, really highlight how central communication is to the whole game of power.
It really makes you think about everyday conversations differently. Okay, finally, let's look at this very concrete example. Gender and power in higher education. The report suggests things aren't as straightforward as just looking at enrollment numbers.
Not at all. It's a complex picture. On the one hand, yes, women have made huge strides. In many regions, they now outnumber men in undergraduate enrollment and are often more likely to actually finish their degrees. That's a massive shift.
That's the female advantage narrative we sometimes hear.
Right, but the report shows that advantage has limits. First, there's what they call horizontal gender segregation. Women might be the majority overall, but they tend to be concentrated in certain fields, humanities, education, health sciences, and remain underrepresented in others, particularly STEM fields like engineering and computer science.
So even when they get in the door, they're often channeled into different areas.
Often, yes. And those areas sometimes lead to less lucrative career paths, which has long-term economic consequences. Plus, that overall enrollment advantage women have, it tends to disappear at the postgraduate level. Fewer women proportionally go on to master's and doctoral programs.
And for those who do stay in academia, what happens then?
Well, the inequalities continue. The report points to persistent gaps in research performance metrics. On average, male academics tend to publish more papers and often in higher impact journals.
Why is that?
The report suggests various factors, potential biases in peer review, differing institutional support, maybe even disparities in the time available for research due to unequal distribution of caregiving responsibilities outside of work. All this contributes to the glass ceiling.
The glass ceiling, meaning fewer women reach the top jobs.
Exactly. Women are consistently underrepresented in senior faculty positions like full professorships across the board: US, Canada, Europe, India, Japan. Many places show this pattern.
And what about pay?
There's still a gender pay gap, even for men and women in the same roles with similar experience. The report mentions things like differences in starting salary negotiations or slower promotion rates for women potentially contributing to this. And it's not just faculty. Women are also underrepresented in senior university leadership roles.
So despite more women entering university, the structures of power within academia, shaped by social norms, maybe unconscious bias, historical patterns still create significant barriers to equal participation and advancement.
That seems to be the core message. It's a really clear example of how power operates systemically, even when surface-level access seems to have improved.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, it feels like the big takeaway is just how complex and pervasive power really is.
I think so. It's not just one thing. It's relational, as Castell said. It works through force, yes, but also crucially through shaping meaning, through discourse, like Bourdieu and Foucault showed us.
And historical context matters hugely, like the China-Europe comparison demonstrated. Plus, we need specific tools to even analyze it properly in our own lives, like Chavorna and Jägerskog outlined.
Right. And the higher education example is a stark reminder that power dynamics can persist and create inequality even when things look like they're getting better on the surface. It's about looking deeper.
So understanding all this, it's not just academic, is it? It gives you a sharper way to look at the world, to understand why things are the way they are, and maybe even where change is possible.
Exactly. It encourages that critical perspective, looking beyond the obvious explanations for social phenomena.
So a final thought for everyone listening. Considering all these different facets of power, the historical structures, the way language works, the subtle biases in institutions where, in your own life, or maybe your community, do you see these power dynamics playing out most clearly? Where might it be worth looking a little closer? Something to definitely mull over. Thanks for joining us.